Chapter 1. The Crying Star. The planet of Durain, once a beacon of hope in the galaxy, now stood on the brink of extinction, its once thriving cities now dilapidated ruins, and its inhabitants struggling to survive amidst a world that had long since turned its back on them. Durain had been a world known for its prosperity, its advanced technology, and the brilliant minds that had once forged a peaceful society. It was a place where hope was not just a word, it was a way of life. But that hope had faded over the centuries, leaving behind only a haunting shadow of what it had once been. The air was thick with the weight of loss, and the ground was covered in dust, as though the planet itself had forgotten what it was like to be alive. In this barren world, one family clung to the remnants of their past, struggling to find meaning in a world that had left them behind. This was the world of Zaraya, a young girl who had known nothing but sorrow for as long as she could remember. Zaraya was only 13 cycles old, yet her life had been marked by hardship, by the absence of the one person who had once been her world, her father. The memory of his laughter, the sound of his footsteps echoing through their small, humble home, was still fresh in her mind, even though it had been nearly 3 full years since he disappeared without a trace. Her mother, Leia, had never been the same after that day. Once a vibrant and full-of-life woman, Leia had become a shadow of her former self, consumed by grief and the endless torment of unanswered questions. Every night, Zaraya would lie awake in the silence of their small dwelling, listening to the soft sobs that emanated from the other side of the room. Her mother's cries were not just the sound of mourning. They were the sound of a soul lost in a never-ending abyss, of a heart that had been shattered beyond repair. Zaraya had tried, countless times, to console her mother, to offer words of comfort, but nothing seemed to ease her pain. Every day, it felt like they were both drowning in their own despair, with no one to throw them a lifeline. Durain was a planet that had long since abandoned its own sense of community. The population had dwindled, and the few who remained had become disconnected from one another, as if the weight of the planet's decline had driven them all into isolation. The once bustling cities were now ghost towns, their streets empty and their buildings crumbling under the weight of neglect. The people who still lived there had grown cold, indifferent to the suffering of others. There were no governments left, no leaders to turn to for guidance. The planet was governed by survival, and survival alone. It was a place where no one cared about the troubles of others, and where the pain of a mother who had lost her husband was nothing more than a distant echo. It was a world where the tears of one could easily be ignored, where the cries of the heart could be drowned out by the noise of the endless struggles for survival. Zaraya had grown up in this world, had grown accustomed to the silence that filled their home, the absence of her father's presence haunting every corner of their lives. Her mother had once been a woman of strength, a woman who had fought for her family and her community, but now, she was a shell of the person she had been. Zaraya could see the weight of her mother's sorrow in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, in the way she looked at her. Leia no longer had the energy to smile, no longer had the will to fight. She had given up, and with her, Zaraya had lost a part of herself. They were both adrift in a sea of grief, with no direction and no hope of rescue. Zaraya, however, was different. Despite the overwhelming sadness that seemed to pervade every aspect of her life, she still held on to a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. She didn't know what she hoped for, exactly, but she knew she couldn't let the darkness consume her as it had her mother. She couldn't allow herself to be swallowed whole by the same sorrow that had taken her mother's spirit. There had to be more to life than this. There had to be something worth living for. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many times she reached out to her mother, nothing seemed to change. The sorrow was like a deep well, and they were both trapped at the bottom, unable to escape. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last light of day faded into the cold darkness of the night, Zaraya found herself standing at the edge of the settlement, staring out at the sea. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks, the sound of the water mixing with the howling wind. The sky was a deep shade of purple, streaked with the fading remnants of the day's light. It was a beautiful sight, one that Zaraya had always found comfort in, even as the world around her seemed to fall apart. The sea was vast, endless, and full of mysteries. It was a reminder that there was a world beyond the small, isolated village that had become their home. It was a reminder that life didn't have to be like this. There was more to the universe than the pain she felt, more than the grief that had consumed her mother. But as Zariah stood there, lost in her thoughts, a strange noise reached her ears, a faint hum, like the sound of something mechanical. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as the sound grew louder, she realized that it was coming from the sky. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw a small, silver craft descending from the heavens, its engines glowing bright against the darkening sky. It was like nothing she had ever seen before, sleek and angular, its surface gleaming in the fading light. It wasn't from Dirain. It couldn't be. No ships had come to the planet in years. And yet, here it was, descending toward the ground, as though it had come from another world entirely. Zariah's heart raced as she watched the ship land on the outskirts of the village, its engines humming as it came to a halt. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of what this meant. But before she could move, the hatch of the ship opened, and a figure emerged. A human man, dressed in a strange, dark uniform, his face hidden behind a helmet. He stood tall, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were taking in his surroundings. He seemed out of place in this desolate land, as though he didn't belong here. And yet, something about him caught Zariah's attention, something that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that perhaps there was still hope for her mother, for their world. The man took a few steps forward, his gaze scanning the horizon before landing on Zariah, who stood frozen in the shadows. For a moment, their eyes met, and Zariah felt a strange pull, a sense that this was no coincidence, that this man had come here for a reason. The man's eyes were deep and serious, and though she couldn't see his face clearly, Zariah could sense the weight of something unspoken in his gaze. He didn't speak, but as he walked toward her, she found herself stepping forward, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. "Who are you?" Zariah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she could feel the words escaping her before she even had time to think. The man paused, his helmet tilted slightly as he studied her. He seemed to hesitate, as though unsure of how to respond, but after a long moment, he spoke. "I'm Lieutenant Jace Harper," he said, his voice muffled slightly by his helmet, but still clear enough to send a chill down Zariah's spine. "I come from Earth. I'm here because I need help." Zariah's mind raced, the words reverberating in her head. Earth. She had heard of Earth, of course. It was a place spoken of only in whispers, a distant world that seemed like nothing more than a dream. But here, standing before her, was a human from that very world, a world she had never thought she would encounter. She had always thought of Earth as a far-off place, one that held no meaning for her life. And yet, here he was, asking for her help. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and without thinking, she spoke. "My mother. She's been crying every night since my father disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. No one on Dirain can help us. Please, can you help us? Can you help my mother?" The man, Jace Harper, stood still for a long moment, his gaze softening as he took in her words. Then, with a slight nod, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'll help you," he said quietly, his voice steady and full of conviction. "I promise." Zariah's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that could change everything. Zariah's heart raced, her mind struggling to comprehend the weight of Jace's words. "I'll help you." Those simple words echoed in her chest like the distant call of something long forgotten, a promise of something beyond the endless sorrow that had consumed her world for so long. For the first time in years, hope stirred in her heart, fragile yet undeniable. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was something. It was more than she had ever dared to wish for, and it was real. Jace Harper was no longer just a figure from a far-off world, a distant curiosity, but a potential answer to the relentless questions that had haunted Zariah and her mother for what felt like an eternity. He was here, standing before her in this barren landscape, offering a chance to lift them from the depths of despair, offering a way to find her father or, at the very least, understand what had happened to him. To know, after all this time, what had become of the man who had been both a protector and a source of joy in her life. Zariah hesitated, her gaze locked with Jace's, as if searching for any hint of insincerity or false hope. But all she found was a quiet determination in his eyes, a conviction that stirred something deep inside her. The pain, the fear, and the weight of the last 3 years came crashing down upon her, But in that moment, standing in front of this human from Earth, she felt like she could finally breathe. She had found someone who might help, someone who cared enough to listen, someone who wasn't just an indifferent bystander in the theater of her suffering. "Follow me," she said quietly, her voice trembling with both excitement and uncertainty. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the village. The wind picked up behind her, tugging at the hem of her tattered tunic, and she felt the weight of the past few years lifting, if only for a moment. The path ahead seemed unclear, uncertain, but she knew that it was the only one she could take. She had to try. For her mother, for her father, and for herself. As they walked through the village, Zariah's eyes remained fixed on the ground, her mind racing with questions. What would Jace be able to do? Could he truly help them? Or was this just another false hope that would ultimately let them down? The streets of the village were eerily quiet, the few remaining inhabitants of the settlement going about their lives without acknowledging the presence of the two strangers. Durain was a dying world, and the people had long since grown accustomed to the bitterness of it all. They no longer believed in rescue, in help, in anything that could change their fate. They had accepted their world for what it was, and the idea that someone, a human no less, could offer a solution was unthinkable to them. Zariah led Jace to her home, a small, rundown structure nestled in the farthest corner of the settlement. The house was simple, made of stone and wood, its walls weathered and worn by the passage of time. It was cold inside, despite the warmth of the setting sun, and the air felt thick with the silence of years gone by. As Zariah stepped inside, she found her mother sitting in the same spot she always did, her hands folded in her lap, staring into the empty distance. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering flame of a small stove in the corner. Leia's face was pale, her eyes hollow, as if she had forgotten how to feel anything other than sadness. Zariah swallowed hard, her throat tightening as she turned to Jace. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I brought someone, a human from Earth. He says he can help." Leia's gaze flicked up slowly, her eyes locking onto Jace, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flash of something: hope, fear, disbelief before the emptiness returned. She didn't speak at first, as if trying to understand if this was some cruel dream or a reality she wasn't ready to face. Jace took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Lieutenant Jace Harper. I'm here to help," he said, his tone steady, trying to offer something that would make sense to Leia, something tangible amidst her years of grief. For a long time, Leia didn't respond. The weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders, and she wasn't sure if she could bear it any longer. She had given up hope of ever finding out what had happened to her husband, had convinced herself that he was gone forever, lost to a planet that had turned its back on everything that had once mattered. But now, standing before her was this human, offering the very thing she had long since stopped believing in answers. Leia's voice came out hoarse, a whisper laced with disbelief. How can you help? How could you possibly know anything about him?" Jace took a deep breath, his eyes softening with understanding. "I can't promise I know everything, but I can promise I'll try. Your husband's disappearance, it's not an isolated event. There's a larger picture here, something far beyond the borders of your planet. I've been tracking something. I think it might be connected to your husband." Zariah watched her mother closely as the words sank in. Leia's gaze never wavered from Jace, and for the first time in so long, Zariah saw a flicker of something in her mother's eyes, something beyond the endless sorrow. It was the faintest spark, but it was there, and it was enough. I don't understand," Leia whispered. "What do you mean? How is this connected?" Jace didn't immediately respond. He walked over to a small table in the corner of the room and set down a small, sleek device. It was unfamiliar to Zariah, but the way it hummed with energy suggested it was something advanced, something from another world. "This is a communications device," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "It's connected to a much larger network. I've been using it to track signals in this sector. And recently, I picked up a distress signal. It's coming from somewhere near Durain. I believe it's related to the disappearance of your husband." Zariah's heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening as she processed the weight of Jace's words. Her father, could he still be out there? Could he be alive, somewhere in the far reaches of space, waiting for someone to find him? Leia's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Do you really think you can find him? After all this time?" "I can't guarantee anything," Jace replied softly, his gaze steady. but I'm willing to try. I'll use everything I have to find him, to uncover the truth. I promise you that." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Zaraya saw her mother's shoulders relax, the weight of the years lifting, if only for a moment. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know where this strange, unexpected journey would lead them, but for the first time, she felt the spark of something inside her, something she had nearly forgotten: hope. Chapter 2. The search begins. The days following Jace's arrival were filled with a strange mix of anticipation and fear. Zaraya and her mother found themselves caught between the hope that Jace's promise might actually bring her father back and the fear that they were chasing an illusion. The thought of having her father return, of finally being able to hug him again, was something that felt impossible, too good to be true. But at the same time, the desperation they both felt, Leia's grief and Zaraya's silent yearning for her father, made it hard to ignore the possibility that they might be on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary. Jace had explained that his ship had been damaged during his journey, but it was functional enough to carry out the necessary investigations. Together, the three of them worked around the clock. Jace used his communication device to trace the distress signal he had intercepted, while Zaraya and her mother assisted him with whatever they could. Though the task was daunting and the planet's resources limited, there was a sense of purpose that had long since been absent from their lives. They were no longer just living in the aftermath of loss. They were doing something. They were fighting to reclaim the family they had lost. Each passing day brought them closer to the truth, though the answers they uncovered only deepened the mystery. The signal Jace had found seemed to lead in unexpected directions, shifting constantly, as though it was being intentionally hidden or rerouted. The more they tried to trace it, the more elusive it became. But every time they encountered a dead end, every time the signal disappeared or changed course, Jace remained undeterred. He was relentless, determined to follow the trail no matter how difficult it became. And his commitment gave Zaraya a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't give up on her mother, not when she saw the first flicker of hope in her eyes in years. As they worked through the late hours of the night, Zaraya found herself growing closer to Jace, not just as a stranger who had come to their rescue, but as a kind of anchor, a presence in their chaotic world that felt solid, reliable. He wasn't just a man from Earth who had arrived out of nowhere. He was someone who truly cared, who was willing to risk everything to uncover the truth and help them. It was a strange feeling for Zaraya, one she hadn't anticipated. In him, she saw the possibility of more of a life beyond the confines of Durain, beyond the heartache. And perhaps, just perhaps, a chance to heal her fractured family. But for now, they could only wait and continue searching, hoping that each new signal would bring them closer to the truth. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of their efforts continued to build upon them. Zaraya, Leia, and Jace spent every waking hour trying to unravel the mystery of the distress signal. Every moment felt like they were on the cusp of something, but the closer they seemed to get, the more elusive the truth became. The signal was a riddle, shifting and changing in ways that defied their understanding. Jace, despite his best efforts, could not seem to pinpoint its exact origin. It was as though someone or something was deliberately hiding it from them, leading them in circles. Yet, as the days wore on, the bond between the three of them deepened. Leia, though still haunted by the shadows of her grief, began to find solace in the pursuit of answers. She would sit beside Jace as he worked on the communication device, offering her own insights when she could. Zaraya, who had always felt isolated from her mother, found herself standing beside Jace with a sense of purpose that had been missing from their lives for years. The family, though still fractured by the years of loss, was beginning to mend in its own way. One evening, as the trio sat in their dimly lit home, exhausted from another long day of searching, something unexpected happened. The device that Jace had been using, something that had been silent for hours, suddenly began to emit a soft, steady hum. The faint sound grew louder as the device lit up with an unfamiliar sequence of symbols. "Leia, Zaraya, come here," Jace called out, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and urgency. "I think we finally got something." Leia and Zaraya rushed to his side, both of them eager, though still wary. They had been let down so many times before. How many false leads had they chased? How many dead ends had they reached? The fear that this too would be another empty promise loomed heavily in their minds. But Jace's voice held an unmistakable note of optimism. This is different," Jace muttered under his breath as he worked quickly, his fingers dancing over the device's interface. The symbols on the screen shifted and aligned, revealing a map-A series of coordinates that seemed to indicate a location far outside the known regions of Durain, deep within uncharted space. Zoraya's heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? Could this be the lead they had been waiting for? I think we've found it, Jace said, his voice low, almost reverent. This is no ordinary signal. It's a distress call, but not one that's meant to be easily found. Whoever is behind this, they've been trying to hide it for a reason. But this map hit's pointing us toward a location I've never seen before. It's not far from Durain, but it's in a sector of space that's been unexplored for centuries. Zoraya could feel her pulse quickening, the weight of the moment settling heavily upon her. Could they be closer to finding her father? Could the answers be within reach at last? We need to go there, Zoraya said, her voice full of quiet urgency. We need to find out what happened to my father. This could be it. Leia, who had been watching the exchange in silence, slowly nodded. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the air around them had shifted. Her grief was still there, a quiet, almost unbearable presence, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. For the first time in years, she could see the possibility of something more. The weight that had clung to her shoulders for so long had lightened, just slightly, and with it, a small but powerful glimmer of hope began to take root. We'll go, Leia said, her voice firm but tinged with the uncertainty of the unknown. I don't know what we'll find, but we have to try. For your father. For us. Jace nodded in agreement. I'll get the ship ready. We'll need to move quickly. If the signal is coming from an unexplored region, there's a chance we're not the only ones looking for it. We need to get there before anyone else does. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Jace worked feverishly to ready the ship for launch, while Leia and Zoraya gathered what little they had, a few supplies, some basic equipment, and the determination to press forward despite the uncertainty. Their hearts beat with a mixture of anticipation and fear, knowing that the journey ahead would take them into the unknown. As the ship lifted off from Durain's surface, the familiar landscape of their village shrinking beneath them, Zoraya glanced at her mother, sitting beside her in the cockpit. Leia's face was solemn, but there was a new resolve in her eyes, a resolve that had been absent for so long. Zoraya couldn't help but feel that they were finally doing something right, something that would lead them to the truth that had eluded them for so long. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Zoraya felt a sense of purpose, a direction. The endless grief, the silence that had been their constant companions, was now just a shadow in the distance. They were on their way to something bigger, something that could change everything. As the ship cut through the star-strewn void, heading toward the coordinates Jace had uncovered, Zoraya allowed herself to dream for the first time in years. She didn't know what they would find when they arrived. She didn't know if they would be able to bring her father home, or if the answers they sought would be buried in a web of lies and danger. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, flickers of something more than just survival. They were heading into uncharted space, into a mystery that held the potential to unravel everything they had once known. And, for the first time in years, they weren't alone in their fight. Jace, this stranger from Earth, was with them. He was their ally, their guide, and perhaps, in some strange way, their savior. Chapter 3. Into the Unknown. The journey through the uncharted sector of space was long and fraught with uncertainty. The ship moved steadily, cutting through the quiet darkness of the galaxy at a pace that seemed both too slow and too fast. Zoraya, sitting in the co-pilot seat beside Jace, found herself unable to take her eyes off the view outside the ship's viewport. The stars stretched out before them, distant and cold, but there was something mesmerizing about the endless expanse. The view was beautiful, but it was also terrifying in its vastness. Out there, beyond the reaches of their knowledge, was the answer to their questions, the answers to what had happened to her father. But what else would they find? What other mysteries lay hidden in the unknown? Leia, sitting in the back, was silent, her face unreadable as she stared out the window. Though she had agreed to come, there was still a sense of hesitation in her, a reluctance to fully embrace the hope that Jace's presence had rekindled. She had lived for so long with the belief that her husband was lost, that she had already mourned him, already come to terms with his disappearance. The thought that he might still be alive, that they might find him, seemed too much to bear. What would it mean to face that reality after all this time? What would it mean to finally uncover the truth? Jace, as always, was focused on the task at hand. His hands were steady on the controls, his brow furrowed as he monitored the ship's systems and adjusted their course. He seemed unaffected by the gravity of the situation, as though he had seen and done things like this before. He had promised them that he would find the truth, and he was determined to keep that promise. As the hours passed, the tension in the ship grew. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unacknowledged fears. Zariah, unable to sit still any longer, stood and moved toward the rear of the ship, where her mother was still sitting. She sat down beside her, the cold metal floor pressing against her legs as she looked at Leia. "Mom," she whispered, her voice tentative. "Do you think we'll find him? Do you think we'll find Dad?" Leia didn't immediately respond. She just stared out the window, her eyes distant. For a moment, Zariah thought she hadn't heard her, but then Leia spoke, her voice soft and cracked with emotion. "I don't know, Zira," she said, her eyes still focused on the stars outside. "I don't know what we'll find. I've lived with this emptiness for so long. But if there's a chance, if there's even the smallest chance that we could bring him back, then I have to try. I have to try for you. For both of us." Zariah nodded, understanding the weight of her mother's words. They were both afraid. They were both terrified of what they might discover. But they had already come this far, and there was no turning back now. The answers they sought were out there, waiting for them. They had to find them, no matter the cost. The ship continued to glide through the void, heading toward the unknown. As they ventured further into uncharted space, Zariah couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. She didn't know if they would find her father, or if the journey would lead them to something far darker. But one thing was certain: whatever happened next, they would face it together. And that, in itself, was more than she could have ever imagined. As the days wore on, the silence between the three of them seemed to deepen, stretching out in the confined space of the ship. It was an unspoken agreement among them all that the gravity of their situation required no words. Jace, ever the professional, kept his focus on the ship's controls and systems. His mind never strayed far from the task at hand, tracking the elusive distress signal, piecing together whatever fragments of information he could. Every new piece of data brought with it a sense of forward momentum, but there was also the realization that they were getting closer to something monumental, something that would change everything they had ever known. Zariah couldn't quite put into words what she was feeling. The days were a blur of routine, searching the vast stretches of space, examining the signal's data, and hoping that it would lead them to her father. Yet, even as the hope swelled within her, there was a gnawing uncertainty, a fear that the truth might be too much to bear. She was beginning to understand that finding her father wasn't just about bringing him back home. It was about uncovering everything that had been hidden from them. Her mother had never spoken of it in detail, but Zariah could sense that the pain of the unknown, the years of wondering what had truly happened, weighed heavily on her. How much could Leia bear to know, after all this time? What if the truth was darker than they could ever imagine? The ship pressed forward into uncharted space, the stars seeming to blur as they traveled further from Durain. Every new stretch of sky felt foreign, like they were crossing a boundary that no one from their world had dared to cross before. Zariah had heard stories of explorers who ventured into the deep, unclaimed parts of the galaxy, but they were nothing more than legends. Now, she and her mother and Jace were part of a story that was bigger than anything they had ever known. One evening, as Zariah sat near the viewport, gazing out at the endless darkness, she heard a quiet voice beside her. She turned to see her mother standing next to her, her face still tired, but there was something in her eyes, a spark of determination that Zariah hadn't seen before. "You should get some rest," Leia said softly, her voice carrying a strange warmth. "We don't know what's ahead, but we need to be ready." Zariah nodded, though her mind was far from rest. She could feel the weight of her mother's words. It wasn't just the unknown ahead of them that she feared. It was the fear of what it might cost them once they found the truth. But she couldn't let that fear control her. They had come too far to turn back now. "I'm just thinking," Zariah said after a moment, her voice distant. "Thinking about everything we've left behind, and what we're about to uncover." Leia sat down beside her, her expression softening as she studied her daughter. "I know it's hard. I've thought about it every day since he left. Every night, I would wonder if there was something I missed, something I could have done differently to bring him back. But we can't change the past, Zira. We can only move forward." Zariah turned to face her mother, her gaze full of the questions that had been plaguing her for so long. "But what if? What if we find him, and the truth is worse than we imagined? What if what happened to him isn't just about us? What if it's about something bigger? What if we can't even handle it? Leia took a deep breath, her gaze settling on the distant stars beyond the ship's window. The truth is never simple, Zira, and it's never kind, but we have to face it. I don't know what we'll find, but we can't be afraid of it. Not anymore. Her words were a balm, though they didn't fully erase the anxiety that gripped Zaraya's heart. The uncertainty, the vast unknown that stretched before them, felt like a mountain too steep to climb. But with each passing moment, she could feel herself pushing forward, driven by a force greater than fear-hope. Chapter 4. The Revelation. As the ship ventured deeper into the unexplored reaches of space, Zaraya began to notice something odd. The distress signal, which had been intermittent and evasive, was becoming clearer, more frequent. Jace's eyes flickered with recognition as the device beeped again, a sharp, high-pitched sound that indicated the signal's proximity. He quickly adjusted the ship's course, directing them toward the coordinates that had once seemed impossibly far away. Leia, who had spent most of the journey in quiet contemplation, was now standing beside Jace, her hands trembling slightly as she looked at the data on the screens. The signal was no longer a mystery, it was right in front of them. "We're close," Jace said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of excitement. He had been the one to decipher the shifting codes of the distress call, and now, with the location confirmed, the truth was almost within their grasp. Zaraya, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up quickly and moved toward the front of the ship, her heart pounding in her chest. "What does this mean? What's the next step?" Jace turned toward her, his eyes serious. "It means we're heading straight into the heart of it. Whatever the origin of this signal is, we're about to find out what's behind it. And if your father is part of this, we'll know soon enough." Leia stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the data. "Is it possible he's still alive? Is this really him?" Jace hesitated before responding. "I don't know, but what I do know is that the signal is recent. Whatever it is, it hasn't been out there long. It could be someone or something trying to reach out. It could be your husband." A heavy silence fell over them. Zaraya's mind spun with the implications. Could this be the moment they'd been waiting for? Could they really be about to uncover the truth about her father? Every part of her wanted to scream, to shout with joy, but the fear of what they might find held her back. The truth was not always kind, and the thought of what might have happened to her father, what might have led him to vanish, so suddenly terrified her. The ship lurched slightly as Jace made the final course corrections, bringing them closer to their destination. Outside the window, the stars shifted, and the black expanse of space began to give way to something else, something alien, something foreign. The distant glow of an uncharted planet loomed ahead, its surface a strange shade of blue-green, with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. It was unlike anything Zaraya had ever seen, a world untouched by the hand of time. It was ancient and yet alive, a place that beckoned them forward with the promise of answers. "We're here," Jace said, his voice low and filled with a sense of gravity. "This is it." Zaraya's breath caught in her throat as she watched the planet grow larger in the viewport, her mind racing with questions. Could this be the place her father had been taken? What had happened to him? Was he still alive? And, most terrifying of all, what else would they discover here? The unknown stretched before them like a vast, empty canvas, and the answers they sought were hidden in the heart of that darkness. Leia's voice broke through the tension. "We're not turning back, are we?" Jace shook his head. "No, we're going to find what we're looking for, and we'll face whatever comes together." The ship touched down gently on the surface of the mysterious planet, its landing gears skimming over the strange, smooth terrain. The air outside was thick with an unnatural stillness, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the ship's engines. As they stepped out onto the surface, the landscape around them seemed to pulse with an eerie, quiet energy. The ground beneath their feet was solid but oddly smooth, and the air carried a strange electric charge. "Stay close," Jace warned, his tone serious. "We don't know what's out here. Whatever's behind this signal is likely still nearby. Keep your eyes open." Zaraya, heart hammering in her chest, nodded silently. They were no longer just travelers on a mission. They were explorers, standing on the precipice of something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. The truth, whatever it was, awaited them in the shadows of this alien world. And for the first time in her life, Zaraya felt like she was truly ready to face it.